corruption siphons nearly $3 trillion from the global economy each year. The United Nations Convention Against Corruption, or UNCAC, adopted in 2003, is an international treaty designed to combat this issue. The convention encourages nations to establish laws against corruption, cooperate in corruption investigations, and recover assets acquired through corrupt practices. UNCAC also emphasizes importance of civil society and private sector involvement in anti-corruption initiatives. The treaty's intention is to foster international cooperation and coordination in the battle against corruption. As we delve into the fight against corruption, it's important to note the array of international mechanisms tasked with combating this global issue. These include 1. United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, implementing the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC, and providing technical aid to countries for bolstering their anti-corruption efforts. 1. OECD Working Group on Bribery, enforcing the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention and assessing member countries' compliance to the convention's norms. 1. Financial Action Task Force, FATF, formulating policies to counter money laundering and terrorist financing, both often linked with corruption. 1. World Bank Integrity Vice Presidency, INT, investigating fraud and corruption allegations in World Bank-funded projects and working to prevent corruption in development projects. 1. International Monetary Fund, IMF, assisting countries with fortifying governance frameworks and combating corruption in public finance. 2. Transparency International, a global civil society organization dedicated to combating corruption through research, advocacy, and programs. These mechanisms effectively promote transparency, accountability, and integrity globally by providing technical support, setting standards, monitoring compliance, and raising awareness about corruption's damaging effects. In 2003, the groundbreaking United Nations Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC, was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly. This international anti-corruption instrument was the first of its kind, transcending a mere statement of intent to become a legally binding commitment to develop and implement tangible steps against corruption. Chapter 2, Preventive Measures, formed a critical component of this pact. It provided a detailed blueprint for corruption prevention, including the formation of regulatory bodies, encouraging transparency, advocating societal involvement, and necessitating businesses to maintain accurate records. The chapter underscores the need for a broad spectrum of corruption prevention measures in both public and private sectors. The script adopted a comprehensive approach, tackling a broad spectrum of corruption-related issues. The initial stride was prevention, embedding measures to foster transparency, accountability, and integrity in public and private sectors, creating a formidable barrier for corruption. Next, Chapter 3, Criminalization and Law Enforcement was introduced. This section delineated the laws defining corruption, highlighting the need for active law enforcement and a solid judicial system. This was to ensure corrupt individuals faced appropriate punishment, serving as a deterrent for prospective offenders. The UNCAC created a legal framework that criminalizes corruption, encompassing acts such as bribery, embezzlement, trading in influence, and money laundering. But the efficacy of these laws hinges on their enforcement. That's where Chapter 4, International Cooperation of the UNCAC, steps in. This section promotes global unity in combating corruption by facilitating international collaboration in investigation and prosecution of corruption cases. This collective effort involves legal assistance, information sharing, and even extraditing offenders to ensure justice, demonstrating global unity against corruption. The UNCAC has introduced mechanisms for asset recovery, notably in Chapter 5. Asset recovery. This chapter has a pivotal role as it sets out the guidelines for international cooperation on asset recovery and return. Assets gained through corruption can now be identified, frozen, seized, and repatriated, reducing corruption incentives significantly. This innovative aspect of UNCAC, represented in Chapter 5, is unprecedented in any global treaty. The UNCAC also supports countries, especially those in development, to strengthen their anti-corruption efforts through technical aid, training, and capacity-building initiatives. The UNCAC's Chapter 6, Technical Assistance and Information Exchange, was introduced to encourage knowledge sharing and expertise among governments, civil society, and the private sector. This chapter served as a tool to combat corruption, underlining the importance of cooperation, transparency, and mutual support. It provided these entities with resources to enhance transparency and accountability, making them an essential part of the corruption solution. To conclude, the UNCAC is more than a convention. It's a global initiative against corruption. It aims to cultivate a culture of integrity and accountability, underscoring the significance of joint action. A key element is Chapter 7, focusing on the implementation mechanisms. These mechanisms offer the necessary structure and techniques for effective enforcement of anti-corruption measures by countries. Chapter 8 presents the concluding provisions detailing the processes and technicalities for the Convention's execution. This includes the procedures for signing, ratifying, accepting the Convention, and for amendments and dispute resolution. Since its inception in 2003, the UNCAC continuously evolves to combat corruption globally. The advancements under Chapters 7 and 8 illustrate its ongoing dedication to this cause. This is our battle, our obligation, and our journey towards a more equitable. The United Nations Convention Against Corruption, adopted in 2003, retains its relevance today for several reasons. Firstly, the UNCAC is a global entity. As the most comprehensive international treaty against corruption, it has 187 signatories and parties as of January 2022. This worldwide reach emphasizes its crucial role tackling corruption nationally and internationally. We then consider its multifaceted approach. The UNCAC encompasses various corruption aspects, including prevention, criminalization, international cooperation, asset recovery, and technical assistance, highlighting the need for comprehensive measures. It also advocates good governance, endorsing transparency, accountability, and integrity across all sectors. This advocacy contributes to sustainable growth, poverty reduction, and adherence to the law. In terms of asset recovery, the UNCAC offers mechanisms for identifying and repatriating illegally obtained assets, enabling countries to retrieve stolen assets and deprive corrupt individuals of their ill-gotten gains. International cooperation is another highlight of the UNCAC, facilitating collaboration among countries in investigating and prosecuting corruption cases, and in mutual legal assistance and extradition. This joint approach is crucial for combating transnational corruption and organized crime. The also incorporates a review mechanism for monitoring the Convention's implementation by member states, assessing their progress in fulfilling their obligations. In summary, the UNCAC remains a critical instrument in the global anti-corruption movement, providing a blueprint for international action and cooperation to promote transparency, accountability, and integrity. The importance of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC, is apparent, yet it's essential to note the criticisms and challenges it faces. The main issue is its limited enforcement, with some signatory countries lacking the will or capacity to implement the Convention's provisions effectively, leading to inconsistent enforcement. The UNCAC's non-binding nature, allowing countries to opt out or make reservations, weakens its potency. Critics question the involvement of civil society organizations in its implementation and monitoring processes, arguing this lack of participation hinders broad-based support for anti-corruption measures. Asset recovery is a challenging process, complex and time-consuming, with legal and practical obstacles hindering the recovery of stolen assets. Concerns are also raised over the UNCAC's coverage of private sector corruption, arguing it overly focuses on public sector corruption, leaving gaps in tackling corruption within private enterprises and multinational corporations. The Convention is criticized for a perceived North-South imbalance and a failure to adequately address the role of developed countries in facilitating corruption. Lastly, insufficient resources for implementation, particularly in countries with limited resources, pose significant obstacles. Hence, while the UNCAC is a landmark in the global anti-corruption fight, critics stress the need for addressing its limitations, including effective enforcement across all signatory states and tackling inherent challenges.